I'm Thom in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. Donald Trump has promised big things for the economy once he takes office, but were the populist policies he embraced on the campaign trail just a front for another trickle-down presidency? More on that in just a moment. And Bernie Sanders says Hillary Clinton lost because the Democratic Party no longer represents the working class. Is he right? We'll talk about that and more in tonight's Progressive Roundtable later on in the program. You need to know this. Donald Trump ran for president on a platform of renegotiating or even rejecting the so-called free trade deals that are wrecking our economy and killing our middle class. It was the one redeeming part of his platform, but it could be easier said than done. The Chinese government has now come out and said that any attempt by President Trump to pursue a more protectionist trade policy would have serious, maybe even devastating consequences for the American economy. An editorial published this weekend in the state-run Global Times newspaper said that if Trump slaps a 45% tariff on Chinese imports, as he said he would do during his campaign, China-U.S. trade will be paralyzed. China will take a tit-for-tat approach. A batch of Boeing orders will be replaced by Airbus. U.S. auto and iPhone sales in China will suffer a setback, and U.S. soybean and maize imports will be halted. So, would this actually happen? And what should Americans in general expect from the economy under a Trump presidency? Would he govern like the populist he's campaigned as, or would he govern like the establishment Republicans he's put in charge of his transition team? Joining me now is Dr. Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City, founder of Democracy Works, and author of the new book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Dr. Richard Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. First off, do you think this trade war with China, or that China is warning about, is likely to happen? I mean, would Trump actually go forward with a 45% tariff on Chinese goods? And even if he were to try to use a tariff-based, trade program targeting one country, seems like it would be useless. All that manufacturing just moved to Vietnam.
Yeah, I think very likely this is all going to disappear in a largely symbolic set of little steps that hopefully the media will be willing to hype so that he can actually walk it back and undo the stuff that he was saying. Let me give you a couple of reasons why. Over the last 20 years, almost all of the major corporations in the United States that produce goods for export have moved enormous amounts of their production over into countries like China. In fact, China more than any other. They have invested hundreds of billions, if not more, in that country on the presumption that they would be able to produce there and ship all that back to the United States for purchase by Americans. If the president-elect were to actually go through this, he would be dealing a body blow to mostly American corporations. Let's remember that more than half of what comes here from China is produced by American companies, subsidiaries that were established at great cost in China. Whether these large companies are going to take this lying down or be happy about it, that's a long shot, and for a president who squeaked in to office with a very small margin, he hadn't lost the popular vote, making an enemy of those large corporations would be a very strange political decision.
Well, Trump made infrastructure spending a big focus of his campaign pitch. Do you think a Republican Congress would go along with this? They've been blocking that when President Obama has proposed it, and the Democrats have for 8 years now.
Well, you know, it's more interesting. On the one hand, it shows that the Trump people perhaps understand that the reliance since 2008 on the Federal Reserve, on low interest rates, on pumping up the money supply, has produced a very poor quote-unquote recovery, one in which huge numbers of people remain unemployed, in which the median income has barely come back to where it was before it hit, when most people know that their jobs are less secure, have fewer benefits, etc. There's a recognition that maybe what was said by Keynesian and other economists that you ought to have a stimulus that lasts longer, a stimulus that's bigger with the government spending, may be the only thing left to try to jumpstart this so-called recovery so it actually merits the term. On the other hand, as you put it, the Republican Party has been campaigning for as long as I can remember that there shouldn't be deficits, that deficits are terrible, that deficits have to be avoided. They've been beating that drum forever. And the only way President-elect Trump could have a big spending program on infrastructure at the same time that he promises to cut corporate taxes and expand military spending would be to run enormous deficits. How that Republican Party is going to go back to its roots and tell all those people, forget what we told you, it's a new day, it's a new direction, that's another political nightmare that I don't think the president-elect really wants to go into. And remember, the members of Congress have to run again, or many of them do, in 2 years. They're going to have a lot of questions about having to reverse course like this.
But what you're describing is exactly what Ronald Reagan did in 1980. He campaigned against the $900 billion budget or debt that we had at that time, and then tripled the national debt. Massively spending to stimulate the economy. Do you think that the Republicans will do what they did under Reagan and cut taxes at the same time as they ramp up deficit spending to make it seem like the tax cuts are growing the economy when actually it's the deficit spending growing the economy?
Well, to be harsh, but to also be honest, yes, I think they might try for that with the hope that by cutting taxes on corporations and boosting up infrastructure spending, they might also, given their control of Congress, limit the damage that does to the deficit by matching the increase in spending on infrastructure by cutting social programs drastically. That was the Reagan strategy, to kind of starve the government by focusing on a few things, cutting taxes, and then yelling to everybody that they can't afford the social programs. The Republicans might manage something like that and go for it. Then their risk is that the millions of people who will be directly damaged by cutting social programs, those are not only Democrats. Those include large numbers of Republican voters, too, and there again, they face real headwinds. You know, for me, I'm watching a Democratic Party that could not fix this economy and went down because of it, handing it off to a Republican government which is not one whit better able to handle the level of complex difficulties that have accumulated over the last half-century.
Donald Trump now says he wants to immediately deport 2 to 3 million undocumented immigrants. What kind of effect would that have on the economy, in particular wages?
Perfect. Let's go through it. Number one, those 3 million, let's assume it's that number, the 3 million that he says he's going to deport, those are people who currently buy food, buy clothing, rent an apartment, drive a car. Those are 3 million people that are not going to be buying goods and services if they are thrown out of the country. Have you considered, President-elect Trump, what the impact will be on countless businesses, large and small, to lose all of that? Number two, those are people who work at the bottom of our society. Because they are undocumented, they are usually abusively treated by their employers, who know that these workers can't fight back because their immigrant status makes that dangerous for them. They're going to either have to forgo these workers, and then how are they going to run their businesses, or they're going to have to hire the people that are left here who are going to be able to drive a much better bargain about wages. The very people who didn't raise the minimum wage under the argument, half true, half not, that it might hurt some small businesses, seem now ready to throw out 3 million people, which is for sure going to have a very similar kind of effect. It may be good PR for a few weeks, but as the effects sink in of what is being proposed here, you're going to recognize the enormous economic role that those 3 million underpaid but hardworking people have in fact meant to the American economy, and that's going to be a painful lesson both for the people but also for Mr. Trump.
Yeah, and Donald Trump also has accused the Federal Reserve of politicizing itself by refusing to raise rates until after the election. What kind of monetary policy do you think we'll see under Trump administration, and to what extent can any administration actually influence the Fed?
Well, there's not only a problem of the administration influencing the Fed, there are also serious problems about what the Fed can do to influence interest rates. Money moves across this country and internationally by many players with big bucks to throw into the process. They can undo, they can cancel the effect even of what the Federal Reserve does, let alone asking the question whether Mr. Trump can control Janet Yellen and the other governors, especially if he's doing things that get them upset. Let's give you an example. If he follows through on the traditional Republican push to raise interest rates, because somehow they're worried about this inflation that could come, although it hasn't for 8 years, well, then maybe they'll get Janet Yellen and the others to do it. But let's all remember what a rising interest rate does. It makes buying a home on a mortgage more expensive. That'll hurt the housing market. It makes buying a car on time more expensive. That'll hurt the automobile market. It makes it more expensive to carry your credit card debt. It makes it more expensive for students to pay for school. All those are constituencies that will be directly negatively affected by a rising interest rate. Do you really want to do that at a time when the American economy hasn't really recovered from the body blow of 2008? Very dangerous for a politician to do that kind of thing. That can really come back to haunt you.
Yeah. In just the last 10 seconds here, Dr. Wolff, do you think that Trump is going to govern as a populist or as a classic Republican?
My bet right now is that we're going to see a major ratcheting down. We're going to see some symbolic activity that makes it look like he might do it, but not much, no. He's going to be knuckled down by the very difficult realities of the American economy.
Richard Wolff, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Coming up, naming a white supremacist media baron like Steve Bannon to serve as your chief White House strategist isn't normal. So why is the media acting like it is? More on that in tonight's Progressive Roundtable right after the break.
Coming up tonight on the News with Ed Schultz. Tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, Question More.
You're watching an RT America special report.
Man, it ain't about him. It's about you. It's about me. It's about everybody.
Basically, everything that you think you know about civil society had broken down.
There's always going to be somebody else one step ahead of the game.
We should not be in the business of normalizing violence.
We don't need people that think like this on our planet.
This is an incredibly tense situation.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours poring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question More.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? Now I've interviewed you too. Question More.
Welcome back to The Big Picture. The Donald Trump administration is shaping up to be just as bizarre as everyone thought it would be. There was a brief moment there on Wednesday after Trump visited Washington and met with President Obama when it looked like he might actually try to govern in a responsible, maybe even moderate way. But that moment is fading and fading fast. After throwing a sop to the Republican establishment Sunday by picking RNC Chair Reince Priebus to serve as his chief of staff, Donald Trump then showed his true colors Sunday by naming Steve Bannon his chief White House strategist. Bannon, of course, was the Trump campaign's CEO, so there's some objective logic to this pick, but there's nothing normal about Bannon, and there's nothing normal about someone like him working in the White House. Before he jumped onto the Trump campaign, Bannon headed up Breitbart, the internet's go-to site for white nationalism, xenophobia, and racism. It likes to play itself off as anti-establishment, but Breitbart mostly just runs stories about how great the Confederate flag is, how feminism makes women ugly, and how evil Muslim refugees are coming to ravage a community near you. It also has an entire section for stories about black crime, which should tell you just about everything you need to know about the worldview of its audience. And here's the really scary thing. Steve Bannon apparently shares this worldview. According to court documents, he once told his ex-wife that he didn't want their daughters attending a certain private school in Los Angeles because too many whiny Jews went there. His words. Lovely, just lovely. Here we are in 2016, and the guy set to head up strategy for the next president of the United States is a raving anti-Semite who used to run a propaganda site for white nationalists. This isn't normal, and no one should ever pretend otherwise. Joining me for tonight's Progressive Roundtable are Alex Lawson, Executive Director of Social Security Works, and Jessica Jackson Sloan, National Director and co-founder of #Cut50, who's in town with Van Jones of CNN to urge President Obama to grant more clemencies before Trump takes office. And Alex, Jessica, great to have you both with us.
Thank you.
And good on you for working on clemency. We need more of it. I've been observing over the last few days in the media, and I'm talking about like the Washington Post and the New York Times, the normalization of Trump. And it strikes me, it's almost like the press is falling all over itself to make him normal, to make him seem normal, to like reassure us all. I'm not reassured. I'm curious your thoughts. Jessica?
Absolutely. I think this is really dangerous. There are a lot of components of that campaign, many of which Bannon was responsible for. The entire narrative about immigrants being responsible for crime in this country, talking about how Islam was intertwined with rape, drawing a very, very harsh line between us and them. And now that's coming into our White House. That's not normal. He's talking about uniting a country, but he brings one of the most divisive members of the right into his own White House staff.
Yeah. Alex, he's going to have the job that Karl Rove had. Mm-hmm. And I think you could probably make an argument that Karl Rove wasn't that radically different. He just was far more polished. What do you think?
I actually disagree with that. I think that Bannon is different. He's by no means a Republican or a conservative in any way, shape, or form. He is the leader of this rising alt-right, which is just rebranding of white nationalists. He created the space that, tried to make white nationalism, white supremacy hip and fun. That's what Bannon did, and that is not normal at all. And he will be sitting yards from the Oval Office. That's just something that I think one of the things is that the vast majority of the American people do not believe that this is actually the case, right? And the media is not doing their job. They call him like the ultimate outsider or things like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, the headlines.
It's unbelievable.
Or ally.
But it's actually totally believable, seeing as though the media failed at literally every single step along the way during the entire primary, the entire general. This is just continuing to fail in their duty to be reporting the facts.
Yeah, I wrote a piece for Alternet today in which I suggested that the media has just inked a 4-year, 24/7 contract with America's #1 reality star that's going to be, as Les Moonves says, bad for America, but insanely profitable for CBS. Thoughts?
Absolutely. And I think, right now we're seeing a reaction to this. You're talking about it. I saw a petition today boycotting people when he was on the cover of it. I know there were multiple Facebook posts and articles going around about the treatment he got on 60 Minutes and in the story they were telling, just glossing over all the hateful rhetoric that he brought to the American public during this election. But my biggest concern is that over time, these messages will continue to bear down on the public, and you're going to hear it from so many different mainstream media sources. It's just going to become normal to say, oh, well, you know, there was Donald Trump who said whatever he had to say to be elected, but here's presidential Donald Trump, and they're two different people. But they're not.
Yeah. We're seeing Duterte in the Philippines.
The joke, it's a very sad, terrifying joke, is on the press, because the first thing that the Trump White House is going to do is take full aim at the press and muzzle it and try to destroy it in any meaningful way, so that it becomes nothing more than just printing their press releases, the propaganda press releases that will be drafted by Bannon. That's the press that, and if not, you know, his children who are on the transition team, who he wants to get security clearances while they run his business, they're going to probably sue these media companies. This is not normal. There's nothing normal about it. And the press, I think, right now is thinking that maybe if they curry favor, they'll get access, you know, the normal way things work. But they're going to find that this is not normal.
Yeah, sad. One of, if not the major reason Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump is that white working class voters in the Rust Belt who normally vote Democratic either switched their votes to Trump, didn't turn out to vote, or refused to vote for any of the presidential candidates. This was the exclamation point of a decades-long trend, declining support for Democrats among white working class voters, a trend that Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders says personally humiliates him.
I think there needs to be a profound change in the way the Democratic Party does business. It is not good enough to have a liberal elite. I come from the white working class, and I am deeply humiliated that the Democratic Party cannot talk to the people from where I came from.
Isn't the issue for Democrats now less one of trying to win over specific demographics and more one of rebuilding globalist and, or repudiating, excuse me, globalist and neoliberal policies like these so-called free trade deals, Alex?
I think the failing of the Democratic Party is incredibly clear. You can't be kind of for working families and kind of for Wall Street.
Did this start with the third way and Harold Ford Jr. and Bill Clinton?
100%. When they made the deal that they were going to actually represent Wall Street, and that was where the money was going to come from, what they must have missed is that those dollar bills actually can't vote. So the working families around this country who Wall Street was devastating are like, well, why would I vote for this party that's not working for me? It's working for Wall Street.
And yet Harold Ford Jr., who ran the Third Way organization, or maybe there was another name for the other analog, you know, he's like all over the media continuously. I mean, the neoliberalism is alive and well. Your thoughts on that, Jessica?
Yeah, I think this was a huge failure in messaging in a lot of ways. I look at this with criminal justice all the time. You know, I met several working class Americans who live down in the Rust Belt or in the South, many of whom have had contacts with the criminal justice system, many of whom sat there and said they're voting for Trump. They don't understand that the policies being touted by the Republican Party aren't ones that align with their own interests. The Democrats have the policies that will help them, but they're just not getting out the message, and they're just not connecting with them.
See, I'd push back on that a little bit. I don't actually think that the modern Democratic Party has demonstrated that it is fully on the side of working families, and the American people are not stupid about that, right? It was a Democratic president who put together a commission that I fought that was set up to cut Social Security and Medicare. That should be a ridiculous concept that a Democratic president would do that. A Democratic president spent all the way down till we just lost the White House to Donald J. Trump pushing for the TPP. TPP, which is NAFTA on steroids. It's just destroying American jobs. That should be ridiculous coming from a Democratic president. And until the Democratic Party understands what should be ridiculous, we're going to just keep seeing the rise in Trumpism in America. Yeah. But it's an easy solution. The Democrats need to choose to fight on the side with and for working families against Wall Street. That's just the only path forward.
Yeah, that's the essential argument of Thomas Frank's new book, Listen Liberal, is that the Republicans represent the 1%, the Democrats represent the top 10%. Nobody represents the bottom 90%, which is what, Page and what's-his-name's study showed, But I'm wandering off. Teaching history about how the Nazis rose to power in Germany and the parallels in Donald Trump's America has nearly cost one California teacher his job. Take a look.
And a history teacher at Mountain View High School is on paid leave after making a comparison between President-elect Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. According to the San Jose Mercury News, Frank Navarro was asked to leave the school Thursday. That happened after a parent sent an email to school officials expressing concern about a lesson plan for Navarro's class that drew parallels between Trump and Hitler.
Coming out of this guy has been teaching the history of the Nazis for 40 years. I mean, it's not like he doesn't know what he's talking about, and it's not like he was engaging in hyperbole. Do we have to worry about a fascist takeover? We just have a minute left. Either of you?
Do we have to worry about it? Certainly. We have to worry about it. We have to maintain maximum vigilance against any creeping authoritarianism in whatever form it takes.
It doesn't seem to be creeping, Jessica.
Well, and as a parent, it really concerns me that our kids are only going to be learning one version of history going forward and one version of what's going on in their country. And that's going to be the version crafted by people like Bannon and Donald Trump.
Yeah. And that version doesn't include warnings about fascism. That version doesn't include the history of labor. There is so much that is being, left behind. It's just, so you don't think this is liberal hysteria, Alex?
I don't think. Look, this is America. 46% of Americans did not vote in this election. That's a lot of people who just didn't vote in this election. That's a lot of room to work with. If we can connect with working families and get some percentage of that 40%, the future changes.
There you go. Alex, Jessica, thank you both for being with us.
Thanks, Tom.
And now the big picture fact of the day. You should think twice before taking a dip in your local swimming hole. New data shows that around 40% of American lakes are too polluted for water-related activities like swimming and fishing. And that's the way it is tonight. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it. I'm Thom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and here's what's coming up tonight on The Big Picture. Donald Trump has promised big things for the economy once he takes office, but were the populist policies he embraced on the campaign trail just a front for another trickle-down presidency? More on that in just a moment.
Yeah, I think very likely this is all going to disappear in a largely symbolic set of little steps that hopefully the media will be willing to hype so that he can actually walk it back and undo the stuff that he was saying. Let me give you a couple of reasons why. Over the last 20 years, almost all of the major corporations in the United States that produce goods for export have moved enormous amounts of their production over into countries like China. In fact, China more than any other. They have invested hundreds of billions.
And Bernie Sanders says Hillary Clinton lost because the Democratic Party no longer represents the working class. Is he right? We'll talk about that and more in tonight's Progressive Roundtable later on in the program. Know this. Donald Trump ran for president on a platform of renegotiating or even rejecting the so-called free trade deals that are wrecking our economy and killing our middle class. It was the one redeeming part of his platform. But it could be easier said than done. The Chinese government has now come out and said that any attempt by President Trump to pursue a more protectionist trade policy would have serious, maybe even devastating consequences for the American economy. An editorial published this weekend in the state-run Global Times newspaper said that if Trump slaps a 45% tariff on Chinese imports, as he said he would do during his campaign, China-U.S. trade will be paralyzed. China will take a tit-for-tat approach. A batch of Boeing orders will be replaced by Airbus. U.S. auto and iPhone sales in China will suffer a setback, and U.S. soybean and maize imports will be halted. So, would this actually happen? And what should Americans in general expect from the economy under a Trump presidency? Would he govern like the populist he's campaigned as, or would he govern like the establishment Republicans he's put in charge of his transition team? Joining me now is Dr. Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City, founder of Democracy Works, and author of the new book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Dr. Richard Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. First off, do you think this trade war with China, or that China is warning about, is likely to happen? I mean, would Trump actually go forward with a 45% tariff on Chinese goods? And even if he were to try to use a tariff-based, trade program targeting one country, seems like it would be useless. All that manufacturers just moved to Vietnam.